Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. Continuing my series for A-level history about the establishment of the Soviet Union. I was talking about how the Red Army helped to disseminate literacy. Remember, prior to the revolution, about 80% of people were illiterate. Those who could read could not all read Russian. Some that could read other languages, such as Polish in the very West. Though in schools in Russian Poland, people were usually required to learn Russian. Or in the south, if you learnt Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani. The Muslims of this empire often learned Arabic because they're reading the Quran, the original, and their languages, such as Azerbaijani or Kazakh, were usually written in the Arabic script. So the Red Armies taught its soldiers to read, and horsemen often rode with Cyrillic letters on their backs to help disseminate literacy. So soldiers felt shamed by being taught out of spellers, baby books. So a teacher spontaneously came up with the phrase, slaves we are not slaves. I can't remember because I had it properly. Mwini Rabi, Rabi Mwini. And it's a phrase which resonated with these soldier scholars, and it was still recalled by some people in the 90s as the first phrase they ever learnt to read. It very much summed up the spirit of the Red Army and Bolshevism. So that became the basis of a Russian language primer. And anyway, the Cyrillic alphabet was introduced into some of the non-Slavonic languages, such as Kazakh and indeed Azerbaijani. Literacy spread rapidly, and books were sold for an extraordinarily low price, below cost price. Bread was dearer than books. So the classics of numerous foreign languages were translated into Russian. The USSR did not recognize foreign copyright at the time, and so paid no royalties. The Wizard of Oz had been published shortly before, and they didn't pay Frank L. Baum an ob for it. It became wildly popular, and because they concentrated so much on the classical oeuvre of foreign literature, that's why many Russian readers were very familiar with the literary canon of other languages, but not having read it in the vernacular. And the Soviet authorities were rather snooty about more modern works, feeling it was tripe or perhaps dangerously counter-revolutionary. Oddly, they thought it entirely acceptable to read things that were written under l'Ancien Régime by writers of fairly conservative outlooks. Anyhow, onto some of the changes wrought on social affairs in the Soviet Union. Divorce had previously been a lengthy and very costly process, and it became available on demand. Contraception and abortion were made available without any restriction. So the communists flirted with the notion of ending the nuclear family as a building block of society. They felt it was an expression of capitalism, that the common ownership of the means of production had extended to women. And Marx had said that the woman is the slave of the slave, and her upliftment was urgent. So Alexandra Kollontai was one of the few prominent Bolshevik women. She advocated free love, that is to say, having liaisons with members of the opposite sex and moving from one to the next and being polyamorous. She said that copulation should be like drinking an active glass of water, completely natural and no restriction, no moral aspect to it. But Lenin said, who would want to drink a filthy glass of water? She was later made ambassador to Sweden, where there was a very broad-minded attitude to such things. Her proposals were not pursued. These Bolsheviks were not quite so free-spirited. Millions of orphans resulted as from the war and the upheaval engendered by the Bolshevik Revolution. The state cared for them, but not very well. There were many street urchins. Some children were forced into street prostitution, and it was a ghastly time for many of the abandoned children. The Soviet Union was only gradually able to rectify the situation. I know a good friend of mine, his father was adopted by someone who was effectively his housemaster of the orphanage and took that man's name as his surname. Anyhow, so famine struck the Soviet Union just after the Civil War, and Lenin appealed to the world for help. So many countries dispatched food to the first communist state. Foremost amongst them was the United States. The communist government was supposed to be the first worker state in the world, and to prioritize providing the necessaries of life for penurious people, but was unable to do so, whereas the capitalist system was. There were manifold faults of the capitalist system, but in the advanced capitalist countries, people were not starving to death. An American businessman and engineer by the name of Herbert Hoover was one amongst those who contributed very liberally. He had made a fortune in mining in Australia, and he came and he organised the distribution of comestibles and the disbursement of life-saving funds. He'd done likewise in Belgium when it was under German occupation and the United States was a neutral country. A Norwegian army officer was dispatched to the USSR to investigate the scale and severity of the famine and to organise relief efforts thereof. His name was Vidkun Quisling, a name that was read to resonate throughout the world as being synonymous with a turncoat. He was horrified by the wretchedness he encountered there and the unimaginable suffering of the Soviet people. It led him to believe that communism was irredeemably satanic and must not be permitted to prosper in the Occident. It must be resisted by all means and at any cost. He was not against the Soviet people per se. Indeed, he wed a Russian. Anyway, that was after his first wife died. He was a Norwegian. He was a man who was later to be the fascist dictator of Norway, and he was led in that direction because he was so aghast at the dreadful and inexpressible suffering of the Soviet people. So the USSR suffered so greatly after the First World War. Why? Millions had been killed. They're mostly young men, the most economically productive stratum of society. Millions of horses and farm animals had been slaughtered. So many factories have been destroyed, likewise coal mines. Industrial production was estimated to be 20% of its pre-war figure. Machinery and railway lines hadn't been broken because they had not been repaired for the better part of a decade. Education and healthcare had almost but ceased to function, and many of the most erudite people had quit the country. So those who had movable capital got it out of the country, and the chattels had been left behind, had often been destroyed in fires and such like. Now, Russia had very few trade relations with the rest of the world right after the Civil War. Trade relations have been totally terminated with Central Powers countries during the First World War, and there would be very few things to sell to Allied countries or neutral countries in the First World War. It had been incredibly difficult to trade with the Allies anyway, because the only route was the Arctic, and shipping was needed for war material. Coal production, steel production, food production, so forth, all fell to a fraction of the pre-war level. The fighting had lasted 8 years, but it set the USSR back 2 decades. In their effort to free people from poverty, the communists had plunged people ever deeper into poverty. In 1922, a German delegation met the Allied Reparations Commission at Genoa in Italy. The Allies refused point blank to permit the Germans to defer the reparations payments in order to allow them a breathing space to build up their economy, since the German economy lay in ruins. The Soviet delegation was in Italy, and more or less on the spur of the moment, they had an ad hoc meeting with the Germans down the Ligurian coast at Rapallo, and there on the Italian littoral, the Rapallo Pact was signed. Walter von Rathenau was one of the members of the German delegation. He was the German foreign minister, and he'd been in charge of the German war economy. As it happened, he was of the Hebraic race. The USSR and the German Republic concluded the Rapallo Pact, in which they dropped all war claims against each other for territory, or indeed compensation. They agreed to do commerce with each other. In a secret annex to the said agreement, the USSR said that it would allow the German military to train on Soviet territory in such weapon systems as Germany was not permitted to possess according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, such as tanks, the use of poison gas, aeroplanes, submarines, and so forth. Despite the ideological differences, the two international pariahs realized that they could form a relationship that was a symbiosis. So the USSR was an outcast. The UK, France, and the United States and several other countries considered her a leper because the Kerenski's government was the rightful one, though they didn't actually have a government in exile, and they found that the communist ideology was to be anathematized. They were miffed over the Soviet repudiation of Tsarist debts, which, of course, was rich coming from France, which had done the self-same thing in the 1790s. The independent states formed in Belarus, the Ukraine, and the like, established governments in exile, but no foreign power recognized them as being sovereign. There was no Russian government in exile, as I said, despite the White Russian emigres milling around Paris, Berlin, Harbin, Shanghai, Belgrade, and such like, always mulling over the day when they would liberate the motherland. Neither Kerensky nor any scion of the House of Romanov claimed to be the Russian head of state. Indeed, there was a very considerable animosity between White Russians of a liberal, even a socialist bent, and those who were of a reactionary penchant. They even assassinated each other occasionally. Vladimir Nabokov, you may remember him, the author of Lolita, his father was a White Russian emigre, but of the liberal outlook, constitutional democrat or cadet. So both factions blamed each other for losing the civil war. I think the liberals and the leftists had more merit to their claim because the czarists had very little purchase on the affections of the man in the street in the Soviet Union. The Cheka was the only arm of the Soviet state that functioned efficiently. So state security was absolute top priority. Security apparatus had very wide scope and untrammeled powers of arrest and detention, torture and execution, and it used these to the very fullest extent. Felix Dzerzhinsky, a man from what's now Belarus, was the first head of the Cheka, the Extraordinary All-Russian Commission for combating counter-espionage, for counting espionage, counter-revolution, and extortion. So his members were known as Chekists. They winkled out opponents and sent them to the Gulag, Glavanya Lager, Upravlenia Lager, main camp administration for corrective labor colonies. So it was slave labor. Or they were executed. Some dissidents who were more important, they used the euphemism liquidated. The Cheka sent agents abroad to infiltrate white organizations. Whites were sometimes lured back to the Soviet Union, being told there was an underground resistance movement that they could join, and a popular rising was imminent. Then there was a chance to arrest, interrogate, under torture these men, and shoot the whites, hoping also the whites would lead them to any existing